Hello and welcome. So today's video is about global justice, and this video is part of a larger series that I have called rather unimaginatively Philosophy 101. And the purpose of this series of videos is to provide you with an introduction to philosophy. But not just the ideas of philosophy. I want to give you the tools that you need to actively engage in the act of philosophy. So in the last video, we examined human rights and their role in shaping justice and governance. So today we're going to focus on global justice, which extends the principles of fairness, equality and rights to the international stage. How should resources, responsibilities and opportunities be distributed across nations? How can we address global issues like poverty, inequality and climate change in a way that is just? So that's what we are going to be wrestling with today. And the agenda for this video is pretty simple. I do try my best to keep it as simple as possible for each of these videos. So we're going to start by defining global justice. We've got to know what it is before we can actually, examine it and understand it and, more importantly, do anything with it. So we're going to define it first. And then we're going to move on and think about some of the theories of global justice. After that, we are going to examine some of the key issues of global justice, things like poverty, inequality, and climate change. And then finally, we are going to think about global justice as it is in practice. So let's get straight into it with the definition. So traditionally, the study of justice has been concerned with what we owe to one another. Things like what obligations we might have to treat each other fairly in a range of domains, including distributive and recognitional matters. All of that is still true and very much relevant, but in recent decades, political philosophy has seen an extension of this. An extension that goes beyond the state and expands into the global sphere. No pun intended. And with this wider scope has come an expansion in the array of topics covered. Some topics, such as the concept of just war, for example, have been discussed for a long time, but others, like the intensification of globalization, economic integration, potentially catastrophic pandemics, and anthropogenic climate change, have found their way into the forefront of the discussions. So in short, global justice is a branch of political philosophy that addresses fairness in international relations and the global distribution of resources, opportunities, and responsibilities. It considers moral obligations beyond national borders. So there's some issues with the definition that we're going to get into in a minute. But before we do, I do have a question. So, and this is purely an opinion piece. So there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It's just something worth thinking about while we are considering global justice. And that question is, do wealthy nations have a duty to assist poorer nations? So, as always, I would like you to pause the video, jump in the comments and answer that question. So do wealthy nations have a duty to assist poorer nations? Have a good think about it. And like I said, there's no right or wrong answers. It's just that the important thing is that you engage the grey matter and start thinking about it. So before we jump into the historical context of global justice, there is an important distinction that needs to be made. A distinction between global justice and international justice, because they sound like they should be the same thing, but they are slightly different. So the distinction between global justice and international justice lies in the entities that they focus on. International justice concerns justice among states or nations, treating them as primary as the what's the word I'm looking for? Treating them as the primary units of moral and legal responsibility. That was what I was trying to say. In contrast, global justice prioritizes individual human beings, examining fairness among them and exploring obligations beyond state boundaries. Global justice inquiries uncover relationships, structures, and agents that might be overlooked in a state-focused justice, as many interactions affecting fundamental human interests transcend national borders. While global justice doesn't exclude state obligations, it does broaden the scope to include other possible duty bearers. Each approach has its advantage. International justice aligns with existing legal frameworks, making responsibility allocation clearer. Global justice, however, allows for a more flexible analysis, considering various roles and capacities beyond states. While they can complement each other, contemporary debates often position them as competing frameworks. So that's the definitional issue that we sort of need to look out for when we're discussing global justice, because global justice and international justice are slightly different. But yeah, so now that we've done that, we can start to think about the historical context of global justice. So the idea of global justice has evolved alongside globalization as economic, environmental, and social issues increasingly transcend national borders. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant envisioned a cosmopolitan world community based on shared moral principles. The roots of global justice can be traced back to early philosophical traditions. Immanuel Kant, for instance, proposed the concept of a cosmopolitan order where all individuals are united under universal moral laws. This idea laid the groundwork for modern theories emphasizing global cooperation and equality. The aftermath of the Second World War marked a significant turning point in the discourse on global justice. The establishment of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 were pivotal in promoting international norms and standards aimed at safeguarding human dignity and rights across borders. These developments highlighted the interdependence of nations and the need for collective action in addressing global challenges. In recent decades, the intensification of globalization has further underscored the importance of global justice. Economic integration has led to increased trade and investment flows, creating both opportunities and disparities. The rapid spread of information and communication technologies has connected people around the world, making it easier to mobilize support for global causes and to highlight injustices that transcend national borders. Anthropogenic climate change has emerged as one of the more pressing issues demanding global attention and cooperation. The detrimental effects of carbon emissions, deforestation, and pollution are not confined to any one nation, and they require a coordinated international response. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities enshrined in international environmental agreements reflects the notion that while all countries have a role to play, their contributions and obligations may vary based on their capabilities and historical contributions to environmental degradation. The occurrence of potentially catastrophic pandemics, like the Big C, for example, has starkly revealed the interconnectedness of global health. The rapid spread of diseases across borders necessitates joint efforts in research, resource allocation, and public health measures. The global health community's response to pandemic exemplifies the critical need for solidarity and equitable access to healthcare resources. The question of economic justice is central to the discourse on global justice. The glaring disparities in wealth and resources between the wealthy and poorer nations raise ethical questions about the redistribution of resources. Debates on fair trade, debt relief, and development aid are integral to the discussion on how to create a more just and equitable global economic system. Global justice also encompasses issues of cultural and social recognition. The protection of cultural heritage, the promotion of human rights, and the fight against discrimination and inequality are essential components of a just global order. Efforts to preserve indigenous cultures and languages and to ensure the inclusion of marginalized groups are testament to the broader commitments required to achieve global justice. Ooh, that was all a bit of a mouthful, but now that we've gone through the historical context of global justice, we have another question. Exciting stuff. So, why do you think global justice has become more important in recent decades? So pause the video and jump in the comments with your response to that. So that question again is, why do you think global justice has become more important in recent decades? So have a think about that. Obviously write that question down and think about that. And once you have responded to that, come back and we will continue. Oh, you're back again. Brilliant. So now that we've looked at the definition, we have looked at the historical context and so on, now we can start thinking about some of the theories of global justice. So we are going to examine cosmopolitanism, or struggle to say that word, statism, and the difference principle. So we have in previous videos we've discussed the difference principle. So that will be familiar to those of you that have been following along with these videos. But we're going to start with cosmopolitanism. So cosmopolitanism posits that all human beings belong to a single moral community, regardless of national borders and boundaries. And this theory holds that justice should be applied universally, treating every individual with equal consideration. Cosmopolitanists argue for the redistribution of resources globally to ensure that everyone has access to basic needs and opportunities for a decent life. One of the core principles of cosmopolitanism is the belief in the inherent worth of all individuals. And this means that the boundaries that divide nations should not be seen as barriers to moral obligations. Instead, the welfare of every person, no matter where they live, should be a concern for all. This perspective advocates for policies that aim to reduce global inequalities, such as international aid, fair trade practices, and environmental protections that benefit the global community. Cosmopolitans also emphasize shared responsibilities. They argue that since many global issues like climate change and economic inequality, arise from the actions of wealthier nations, these nations have a greater obligation to address these problems. And this includes contributing more to the resources that might mitigate the effects of global warming, providing humanitarian aid, and supporting international development initiatives. In essence, cosmopolitanism challenges the traditional notion that a state's primary responsibility is only to its own citizens. It encourages a broader view of justice that extends beyond national borders, promoting a vision of a world where resources and opportunities are distributed more equally, and where rights and dignity of every person are upheld. So, now that we've gone through that, and we've, in a nutshell, as it were, with cosmopolitanism, I have a question. So, this question, I've actually already asked you this right at the beginning, but I want you to think about it again in the context of cosmopolitanism. So, should wealthy nations be obligated to redistribute resources to poorer nations? Why or why not? So that question again is, should wealthy nations be obligated to redistribute resources to poorer nations? Why or why not? So pause the video, jump in the comments and respond to that. So, have you done it? Brilliant. So now we can start thinking about statism. Statism is a perspective in political philosophy that holds that principles of justice are primarily applicable within the boundaries of the nation state. According to this view, states have special moral and political obligations to prioritize the well-being of their own citizens over non-citizens. While statists acknowledge that states may have some responsibilities towards people outside their borders, they argue that these duties are limited and do not override the autonomy of individual nations. A fundamental principle of statism is the importance of national sovereignty and self-determination. Statists believe that each nation has the right to govern itself and make decisions without external interference. They maintain that political communities are shaped by shared histories, cultures, and institutions, which justify a state's prioritization of its own people. As a result, global justice should not impose obligations that undermine national decision-making or force states to redistribute resources beyond their borders. One of the core tenets of statism is that international aid and assistance should be voluntary rather than obligatory. So statists reject the idea that wealthier nations have a moral duty to redistribute resources globally, arguing that such obligations could dilute national identity and erode democratic self-rule. They are particularly crucial in global governance structures that might override the authority of democratically elected national governments, fearing that such arrangements could weaken political legitimacy by shifting decision-making power away from accountable domestic institutions. Statists often draw on social contract theory to justify their position, arguing that the principles of justice arise from agreements made within a political community. Since states are formed through the consent of their members, they contend that obligations of justice apply primarily to fellow citizens rather than people outside of the national community. Additionally, commutarian arguments are frequently used to support statism, emphasizing that shared cultural and social bonds create stronger moral obligations within a nation than they do sort of across the globe. Despite its perceived strengths, statism faces several criticisms. Some philosophers argue that national borders are morally arbitrary and do not justify treating individuals differently based solely on where they were born. Others point out that global interdependence, such as economic ties, climate change, and international conflicts, creates obligations that go beyond the nation state. Also, statism has been challenged on human rights grounds, as it may allow states to neglect humanitarian crises or ignore the suffering of people beyond their borders. In summary, statism defends state sovereignty, national identity, and democratic self-determination, maintaining that justice is primarily a domestic concern. However, it is frequently opposed by proponents of global justice who argue that justice should extend beyond national borders in an interconnected world. This debate remains central to discussions about international ethics, humanitarian aid, and global governance. So now that we have thought about statism, I have a question for you. Do you think that statism overlooks global challenges like climate change? Why or why not? So, as always, pause the video, jump in the comments with your response to that. So that question again is, do you think statism overlooks global challenges like climate change? Why or why not? So, are you back now? Brilliant. Now we can start thinking about the difference principle. Now, if you have been following along with these videos, you will already have some understanding of this already, which is fantastic. So for those of you that have followed along with those videos, I apologize for repeating myself. However, there will be lots of you that haven't seen those videos. So let's get into it. So in the Law of Peoples by John Rawls, John Rawls obviously extends his domestic theory of justice that he developed in his work, A Theory of Justice, and it makes that extension into the international realm. In his earlier work, Rawls introduced the difference principle, which asserts that social and economic inequalities are only justifiable if they work to the benefit of the least advantaged members of society. While this principle was originally formulated within the context of a single nation state, in the Law of Peoples, Rawls seeks to adapt and apply it to global relations between societies, offering a framework for thinking about international justice. Rawls's difference principle in the domestic context argues that inequalities in wealth, income, and power are only just if they ultimately improve the well-being of the worst-off members of society. He maintains that justice should not demand complete equality, but rather a system where inequalities function in a way that uplifts those who are disadvantaged. When applied to the global stage, this principle suggests that inequalities between nations can be considered morally permissible or even beneficial if they contribute to improving the conditions of the world's poorest populations. Rawls, however, does not argue for a global redistribution of wealth similar to how the difference principle operates domestically. Instead, he proposes a duty of assistance to societies that struggle to establish just and stable institutions. A central feature of the Law of Peoples is Rawls' argument that wealthier, well-ordered societies have a moral obligation to assist what he calls burdened societies, nations that face significant obstacles in developing and sustaining just, decent, or stable political institutions. These obstacles can include historical injustices, economic underdevelopment, lack of political stability, corruption, poor governance, or oppressive social structures. The duty of assistance is not a call for unlimited redistribution or permanent foreign aid. Instead, Rawls envisions a temporary responsibility that wealthier nations bear until burdened societies can develop self-sustaining, well-ordered institutions. In contrast to more radical cosmopolitan theories of global justice, which may argue for perpetual wealth redistribution or a more unified global welfare system, Rawls' approach maintains the autonomy of nations while recognizing global moral duties. So at the core of Rawls' principle is two main points, really. So there's tolerance for cultural and political diversity, and there is the assistance to burdened societies. So those are the important bits, right? So now that we have explored that, I want you to think about it and answer a question. So write this down. So what I want you to do is come up with an argument for or against the idea that wealthier nations have a duty to assist poorer ones. Now, I understand this question might seem like a repetition, and to some extent it absolutely is, but I want you to work through the ideas that we've covered. So having similar questions throughout means that you are able to think about that question in different contexts, and hopefully be able to see it from all sides and come up with a more comprehensive and complete answer. So that question again is: think of an argument for or against the idea that wealthier nations have a duty to assist poorer ones. So pause the video, jump in the comments and respond to that. So now that we have thought about some of the theories of global justice, we can now start to think about some of the key issues in global justice. Now, this part of the video is going to be fairly short in comparison to what came before, because I actually only want to quickly look into these issues, because the important thing is the ideas, and if we get too tangled up in the issues themselves, that actually, I think, derails the conversation. So we are going to cover them quite quickly because they are relevant to what we're talking about, but I don't want them to become like overriding. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, so let's start with the big one: global poverty and inequality. So global poverty and inequality are among the most pressing issues in global justice. More than 700 million people live on less than $2.15 a day, highlighting the stark contrast between the world's poorest and wealthiest individuals. The wealthiest individuals control vast resources, creating significant disparities in the quality of life, access to education, healthcare, and opportunities. And the debate centers on whether it is morally justifiable for such inequalities to exist, and if wealth should be redistributed on a global scale to ensure a more equitable world. And there are some key questions that are sort of embedded in that. So is it unjust for some nations to be wealthy while others are impoverished, and should global wealth be redistributed? And those questions are at the core of the issue. So global poverty is something we all have some idea about. We all have thoughts on it, and we all have our position within it. We might not be the ones experiencing such poverty. We might be at the other end of the scale, or you might be experiencing the extreme poverty. So it's an important thing to think about, and it's an important issue, if potentially the most important issue in the world. So I do have a question for you. And that question is, how might a cosmopolitan argue for redistributing global wealth? And how might a statist respond? So pause the video and jump in the comments and answer that question. So that question again is, how might a cosmopolitan argue for the redistribution of global wealth? And how might a statist respond? So have you answered that question? Fantastic. Now that you've done that, we can have the briefest of brief looks at climate justice. So climate justice addresses the unequal burdens of climate change on different regions and populations. Wealthier nations have historically contributed the most to carbon emissions through industrial activities, deforestation, and extensive use of fossil fuels. Yet they suffer less from the consequences such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and food scarcity. Climate justice seeks to establish fair principles for distributing responsibilities for climate mitigation, i.e. reducing emissions, and adaptation, i.e. adjusting to climate impacts. And these principles include, so we have polluter pays, so those who cause the environmental damage should bear the costs of addressing it, and capability, so those with greater financial and technological resources should, in theory, contribute more to solving the issue. So now that we have very, very briefly thought about this, what I want you to do is write down a policy that you think would promote climate justice and tell me who you think should bear the costs and why. So that question again is, write down a policy that you think would promote climate justice and who should bear the costs and why. So pause the video and answer that. So the final issue that we're going to look at is migration, refugees and migration. So global justice, it also encompasses the rights of refugees and migrants, obviously. Conflicts, persecution, and climate change are displacing millions of people, creating urgent humanitarian crises. And the question is, how should nations respond to these crises in a manner that respects human rights and dignity? Some key questions in this area include things like, do nations have a moral duty to accept refugees fleeing from war, persecution, and natural disasters? And how should responsibilities for supporting refugees and migrants be shared globally? So this is a really quite contentious issue, especially here in the UK at the moment, and well, generally in the West overall. So it's an issue that's always in the news. It's always on the top of people's minds, and it's always floating around. It's always being talked about. So it is a massively important issue. So what I want you to do, in a moment, obviously pause the video, but what I want you to do is think about how might cosmopolitanism, which advocates for global citizenship and moral responsibilities beyond borders, and statism, which prioritizes the sovereignty and interests of individual states, how might they differ in their approach to refugee crises? So that question again is, how might cosmopolitanism and statism differ in their approach to refugee crises? So remember that cosmopolitanism advocates for global citizenship and moral responsibilities beyond borders, whereas statism prioritizes the sovereignty and interest of individual states. So how would these approaches, how would these two different camps, how would they differ in their approach to refugee crises? So pause the video, jump in the comments, and respond to that. So, have you answered that one. Fantastic. So we are pretty much near the end now. So we are. Well, we've thought about the theories behind global justice, and we have thought about some of the sort of key issues and that sort of thing. But what about global justice in practice? What does that actually look like? Well, we have things like international institutions, and we have grassroots movements. So, international institutions within global justice are institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. So these organizations, they play a significant role in promoting or indeed hindering global justice. So do these institutions operate fairly, or do they favor wealthier nations? That's a question to which I don't believe there is a precise answer. So we're not going to try and answer that one right now. I just wanted to put that question into your head. The question I want you to answer right now is how can let me try that again. How can international institutions be reformed to better promote global justice? So again, that's institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. We also have things like the European Union and so on, right? So how can international institutions be reformed to better promote global justice? And as always, there is no right answer to this question. It is basically purely opinion, and the important thing is the thought processes that go into it. So how can international institutions be reformed to better promote global justice? Pause the video, jump in the comments, and let me know. So one more thing to say about international institutions is that they are essentially like top down. On the other end of the scale, we have grassroots movements, which are like bottom up phenomena. The grassroots movements, such as those advocating for fair trade or climate action, these movements demonstrate that individuals and communities can drive change without state intervention. So, I have another quick question for you. So, once I've told you the question, obviously, pause the video and jump in the comments. But what I want you to do is write down an example of a grassroots movement that addresses a global justice issue. And how does it contribute to change? And is it actually effective in its effort to contribute to change? So that question again is write down an example of a grassroots movement that addresses a global justice issue. How does it contribute to change? And how effective is it in contributing to that change? So we are basically at the end now. So global justice, it's something that forces us to think beyond national borders and address the interconnected challenges of our time. Whether we emphasize cosmopolitan ideals or prioritize state sovereignty, these debates shape the future of our world. They are, as we move forward in time, they are more and more relevant to everybody. So it is an important thing to think about. And it is an area of thought in which we quite drastically need to make some progress, in my opinion. So before we part ways, I have one final question for you. What do you think is the most pressing issue in global justice today, and how should it be addressed? So that question again is, what do you think is the most pressing issue in global justice today, and how should it be addressed? So that's what I want you to think about as we part ways today. So we have covered a lot. I have tried to condense it down as much as possible because these videos keep getting longer and longer and longer. And I'm trying my best to keep them all under an hour. I'm failing miserably, although I'm doing well today, so that's good. But previous videos I've failed miserably at keeping it under an hour. So I'm trying my best to keep it as succinct as possible. But these are complex ideas and they require some some explanation and some exploration and so on. So there's a lot to it. So you can't do these things in a 10-minute, 5-minute, whatever, quick fire soundbite kind of way. It's just not possible to explore an idea in any great detail or depth in a short format, which is why these videos are so long. But as I say, I'm trying my best to keep them shorter. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. If you haven't done already, then please like the video, subscribe to the channel and all that good stuff. Not only will it tell YouTube that you want to see more of me and my content, it much more importantly also tells YouTube that you are interested in the things that we are discussing today, and therefore YouTube will start showing you content from other creators that are talking about these things as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and we have reached the end. So thank you and goodbye.